the problem with the Mclaren W1. Now, the Mclaren W1, if you don't know, is the new hypercar that just McLaren announced. It's the successor to the legendary Mclaren P1 and the even more infamous Mclaren F1. So it's following a great lineage. And it has one serious problem. It doesn't look all that incredible. I mean, not that it isn't an attractive car. It is a good looking car, but when you compare it to the P1, it doesn't look different enough. Now, you could say, well, you can't make new designs for every single car. That's just not possible. It takes a lot of work and research, and I agree with that. That would be the case, but that's the problem in this situation. They actually already made a new modern design that looks like an even more advanced version of the P1. And they gave it to another car called the Mclaren Senna. Now, the Senna is a special edition McLaren named after Senna. And when you look at that thing, it looks wild. It looks like a race car on the road. Literally, it's full of aerodynamic bits. It looks aggressive, sharp. It looks incredible. And honestly, when they came out with the Senna, if they just said that this was the successor to the P1, just by looking at it, everyone would have agreed. No one would have argued with them. Because that's how wild that thing looks. It looks like a hypercar. But, and it has similar performance numbers to a hypercar, but it isn't the McLaren successor. They never announced it as a successor, so it isn't. It's kind of like the situation with Ferrari and the SF90. Now, they could have called the SF90 a successor to the Ferrari, but they didn't. And that's the main problem with the McLaren W1. When you look at that car, it's good. It looks like a bit more of a modern version of the P1, but when you look at the McLaren Senna, and you just look at these two cars, and you just ask anyone which one of these two is the hypercar, and I'm pretty sure everyone's gonna point at Senna, because it just looks like the hypercar. And that car didn't exist, no, this wouldn't be an issue, but it does exist, and basically you have a McLaren supercar that looks more like a hypercar than the McLaren hypercar does. So yeah, they created an unnecessary problem, and I don't know why they did that. I mean, surely they must have known that they need an awesome design for the successor to such a great line. And I don't know, maybe this was a successor, but they gave it to the Senna. They called it they didn't call it a hypercar, and they just went with it. And because of that, now the W1 looks boring. Just because of another car that they made. They created this problem, and now it looks boring. I mean, everything else about it is a true hypercar. The specs, the power, the handling, everything, it's a hypercar. But it's a hyper, I'm sure of it. They wouldn't mess around with it. But when you look at hypercar, looks are really important. They're supposed to stand out. Even the people who don't know anything about cars or care about cars, when they see it, they have to turn around and look. That's the intention of a hypercar. That's your flagship, your best. And people who know the P1 or the other McLarens, they might not notice it right away unless they come close. But on the other hand, everyone's gonna notice the Senna. So yeah, they kind of dug themselves into a hole and made the car look boring. Now, I'm sure it's not that big of an issue, but I personally think it is because they had the design and they didn't use it properly. If they didn't have the design, fine, this is the best they could do. But the best they could do, they just gave it to the other car. And now we're in a situation where both the Ferrari hypercar and the McLaren hypercar don't look that attractive compared to their predecessors in terms of look. I mean, imagine if the W1 had the Senna's design, and it was being compared to the Ferrari F80. It would have dominated just on looks alone. Everyone would have said that they prefer the McLaren. If they weren't biased, they would have definitely preferred the McLaren. But now, when you look at these two cars, but looks-wise, you could pick one or the other. It's not that big of a stretch. But the looks are a big thing, and you can tell that from the previous Holy Trinity, the Porsche 918, the McLaren P1, and the LaFerrari. I mean, it's obvious the LaFerrari was the wildest looking car in the lineup. I mean, the Porsche 918 looked like every other Porsche. You could literally not tell the difference between it. Which is interesting considering that their new design, the renders look very different, but it's not confirmed yet, so we have to wait about that. But yeah, the Ferrari won on looks with the previous Holy Trinity, but in this Holy Trinity, so far 2 out of 3, nothing really to say about one or the other. It's honestly a matter of preference. No one could point at one and say that looks excellent, much better than this one. Now we have to wait till the third car comes out from Porsche. But until then, this is what we have, and it's not that exciting. And this is a big deal considering everyone was waiting a decade for these cars to come out. I mean, after the P1, the LaFerrari, and the 918, how much tech and innovation and engineering they put in those cars. Everyone's thrilled to see what the new versions of these cars would be. And looks-wise, they're a bit of a disappointment. Now, the Ferrari looks good from certain angles, but the front is the main part, let's be honest. It doesn't look that great. And the McLaren, even though it proportionally looks good, it looks like a regular McLaren. So yeah, that's the problem with the McLaren W1 in my opinion.